So thank you so much, Anthony. I think this is a really, really important and exciting topic. I kind of feel both in the classroom and just on social media, for whatever that's worth, that there's a lot of hopelessness. So Yarran, this is definitely something that you point out in the essay. So could you, like, for people who may not have read your essay, and the essay will be put in the chat, I think, and it's freely available. Could you like summarize briefly how you see philosophy, like what could philosophy to do as a source of hope for us?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. So as Anthony mentioned at the start, we live in pretty hopeless times. There's a resurgence in colonial war in Gaza and Ukraine and elsewhere. There is the climate crisis. There are the multiple, the pandemic, all sorts of sources of strife and suffering and pain and hurt. And behind all those, there are these large social systems which structure our world and which are the root causes of many of these, damaging practices in which we engage: racism, colonialism, capitalism, the never-ending desire that we have to dominate each other and to dominate the earth. So those are some of the causes of hopelessness. I focus on the kind of social and political and structural causes of hopelessness, and I'm sure Alex will have some things to say about some other causes of hopelessness. And so what can philosophy do? I want to so in my essay, I argue that there is a particular kind of hope that can play a role in alleviating this hopelessness, and it's a hope in other people. So hope is generally understood as aimed at some future state of affairs. I hope that I will one day be able to buy a house. I hope that my children will live in a safe world. In contrast, hope in other people is about the present, not the future. And it's about our relationships and the collective action that we can undertake with other people, not a kind of state of affairs in the world. And I think philosophy can foster this hope in other people in a number of ways through the way in which we practice philosophizing with others as an activity. In the essay, I draw on two figures in the large Black radical tradition, Bell Hooks, the educator, and Vincent Lloyd, who wrote a really amazing piece called Philosophy Born a Struggle that was published in the pages of The Philosopher, I think last issue or the issue before. And both of them situate their work, their philosophizing, their theorizing with respect to social movements, consciousness raising, and a struggle that the struggle that people engage in to change their world for the better with other people. And philosophy, by situating itself with respect to this ongoing practical struggle, can not only help us live with, the things that are happening in the world right now, console us for the harms and the damage that we are doing to the world, but can also help us, I think, change or respond to, through collective action, those large-scale structural problems. So that's the kind of hope that I identify in a certain way of practicing philosophy with other people, in engagement with other people.
Yeah, so this is kind of, I think when people think of philosophy and hope, that maybe their minds go to things like modern Stoicism, I don't know, maybe, or to things like Boethius. And then it seems like it's just like, okay, you have to accept the inevitable. And like when I was first thinking about philosophy and hope, and actually began to read Alex's book, I thought, is this going to be, and it isn't, right? But I thought, is this going to be, this like, okay, things are tough, but just tough it out. So that I found really striking, that that you say that philosophy needn't be that sort of like just find rest, find consolation in. So how would you position your work with respect to that sort of classical consolationist philosophy?
So I should say, first of all, that I don't want to knock philosophy as consolation. Consolation's super important. Like, it's really helpful. And it can also form the basis for a praxis, for a way of, of engaging with the world that might have the hope of changing it. And I think what's really great about Spinoza, and I'm sure you're going to bring this up in our discussion with Alex later, what's great about Spinoza is the way in which he connects an attitude with respect to oneself, a kind of consolatory attitude, way of looking at oneself with respect to the world, and power and action. And so consolation for Spinoza is empowering. And I think that's true also of hope with respect to other people. There's a kind of empowerment aspect that it engages in.
Yeah. So this brings me to your engagement with work in a Black radical philosophy, and I find that very inspiring. So I've read a bit about a bit of philosophy, Audre Lorde in particular, and one thing I find very striking in that is that the idea of connecting philosophy to action, particularly collective action, which is very important in your piece. So like when we think of philosophy, I'm going to drag all the sort of like stereotypes of philosophy out now. You think of people sitting all by themselves, thinking. So like how do you think, like, it seems like even now it's difficult for us as philosophers to coordinate action.
Yeah.
So like how concretely are we going to do this? Like, we're academic philosophers. What are we going to do?
I partly want to leave that open. So I think it is part of the action that we can take with others to find new ways and creative ways to engage in philosophy in this new key, in this inspired by this hope, as practicing this hope in other people. I mean, there are all sorts of practices of public philosophy and philosophy generally that I find really powerful in this respect. So the classroom is one of them. And there are classrooms all over, not just in the elite colleges where I teach and the large public universities where you and Alex teach, but there are classrooms in prisons. There are classrooms in concentration camps and detention centers. There are classrooms, with people who are living their own struggles, which are, of course, connected to other people's struggles, but outside the academy. And those modes of teaching, I think, are modes of engaging with each other in a way that can embody this practice of hope in other people.
Yeah, so indeed in classrooms, and I want to just briefly mention that the philosopher is going to have an awesome essay, collection of essays specifically about us doing public philosophy. I want to ask one more question because I thought maybe I could then move on to Alex's book, and then maybe we still have some time to discuss a little bit together before we put it open to Q&A. Yeah, what was I going to say? Yeah, so one more issue. So, and that's the idea, and you bring it up in your essay as well, the sort of idea of philosophical prophecy. So I have that term from Eric Schließer. He has a really awesome little essay about how philosophers can actually create the conditions for their philosophy or for their philosophical ideas to succeed, to somehow have an impact. And I do like that idea of that we can affect real change in this way. So if you want to briefly comment on that.
Yeah. So the idea of prophecy is central to at least some aspects of the Black radical tradition with its connections to a certain, prophetic Christianity. And whether or not one is religious in that sense, I think what one can take from that is the powerful role of the imagination, of creativity, of envisioning. And insofar as philosophy can provide those visions of different ways of living, different ways of being with others, and can communicate those and bring those out, I think that's actually a really important, how did you put it? Way of creating the conditions under which one's philosophy can have an impact. The kind of, inspiration's selling it a little short. I think imagination and envisioning are more powerful ways of putting that point.
That's great. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think that now I'd like to move on to Alex's book, and then we'll see if we still have some time before general Q&A. So thank you so much, Yarran. So Alex, I just want to say, so I read this, I read this book and a bunch of other, I read the complete works of Spinoza just a few months ago, and I got really I thought, okay, I should really read this now. I tried a few times before, let's try to read the Ethics, and it's a really, really, really difficult book. You have to go back the whole time, you really have to do it, and you have to read it in this very slow way that we're not used to. We're used to reading very quickly. So even at some point he says, slow down, slow down.
Mm-hmm.
You might be perplexed now, dear reader, but just slow down. And, later you can see what you think. But then I got really into it and I was so inspired. I thought, this is so great. Like, this happens to some people who read the ethics. Like, I know this guy in Chile who apparently went to live for 2 years in the mountains, after he read it. So this happens to some people. But then I started reading secondary literature and I was perplexed. I thought, I don't quite recognize the Spinoza that I read. So I then read your book and then I thought, here I do recognize something. So I was very inspired by your book. I think it's great. I think people should all read it. And particularly this idea that you have, that beatitude, this idea, this blessedness, which is a very religiously related term, but he fleshes this out in a very unconventional sense. It's not blessedness in any sense that you would have in the traditional Abrahamic religions. So could you talk a little bit, give people who have not read the book a sort of central idea about what it is about?
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm so glad that that was your experience reading my book. I know what you mean about, there are so many different Spinozas, but I feel like the key to Spinoza is this notion, which after all, the earliest text we have from him, he writes about trying to find a true good that is continuous to eternity. And then at the very end of the Ethics, he concludes that, he's found something like this. So I feel like this is his central preoccupation. But maybe I can link it to the question of hope. Mm-hmm. In a way, I think the Spinoza's vision I tried to present starts from almost the opposite point to Yarran's. Yarran mentions all these terrible things in the world, and of course there are. But then there's something sad about all the wonderful things that are in the world as well. There are all these beautiful, happy things, all these loving relationships that people are forming. And the sad thing is, of course, that they're all threatened. They're all precarious, they're all fragile, and they all eventually will be gone. And so Spinoza, in raising this thought of beatitude, beatitude typically means perfect happiness, not just kind of satisfaction or, life satisfaction, or these things that the kind of moral psychologists of today talk about, well-being, things that you can put on an index from 0 to 3, but perfect, perfect satisfaction. You think, well, that seems like an absurd hope. That appears in religious traditions because it's something for another world or another life that isn't like this one, It doesn't have all the things that make that impossible in this world. So the fascinating thing for me about Spinoza is that he thinks that this is something that we can meaningfully pursue, at least in this life, in this world, even if it's not something we can achieve. It makes sense as something to strive for. Now, when I say that, you might think that it's one of these kind of consoling visions, but I'm glad you said that, I didn't quite have that idea, this kind of crudely stoic idea that, well, you can be perfectly happy if you just accept everything that happens. But, Spinoza is well aware that we can't do that. But I think he thinks that the thing that really holds us back is our attachments. You might think that this sounds sort of Buddhistic, but, I link it to the tradition of the Chuang-Tzu, which I think is a little bit different, because Buddhism, in my crude understanding, you're supposed to give up these attachments. But the vision that you have in Spinoza is that you just have to be more flexible about what you can be attached to. You have to learn to attach yourself to more things than you currently are. All the same, you might think, well, this sounds like a kind of pie in the sky idea. It's almost offensive to be talking about something like this, given the sorts of struggles and problems that Yarran mentions that people are facing. But I think that for Spinoza, there's a connection. If more people pursued this kind of goal, then maybe we would be better at dealing with some of these problems that we're facing than we currently are. There are problems that it's very hard to see how we can solve. Wars in Ukraine and Gaza, or, we don't know how to pull 55 billion tons of CO2 equivalent out of the atmosphere. But the things that we can do that are very clear right in front of us that we could easily do, we're not able to do because we're divided from each other. So, in that sense, I think that there is a practical consequence to this seemingly ethereal, otherworldly idea that Spinoza puts forward.
Yeah, I want to make a link to his political philosophy. So you do talk about this too in the book, is this idea that, so what I find very striking, both in the ethics and in the political theological treatise, another book by Spinoza, what I find really interesting is how he fleshes this out as rationality. If everybody were perfectly rational, then we would live in harmony. We would collaborate with each other to make things like science and arts possible. We wouldn't be murdering each other or harming each other. And I don't know, like, what do you think about this idea? Like, do you agree that, like, if we were perfectly rational, there'd be less war and that sort of thing? I like the way that he fleshes this out in the rationalist tradition, of course, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, yes, Spinoza talks about living under the guidance of reason and these
That's
things.
right, yeah.
And I try to push against a reading, which is very popular, which links Spinoza to a kind of Enlightenment tradition, that, he's one of the early cases of these people who say, well, if we were just a bit more sensible and, didn't get hung up on these silly things or fall victim to these cognitive biases, as kind of YouTube guys might say today, then we would be able to solve all of our problems. And I admit that there are times that he sounds like that. But I think that for Spinoza, that's a kind of interim solution, to our real philosophical problems, to the real human predicament. I think he thinks, well, if you're going to aspire to something short of beatitude, which is a very complicated, very difficult thing to understand, then, set yourself goals that won't put you in direct conflict with other people for no good reason. In other words, I feel like Spinoza says, if you have to emulate some kind of model, if you have to have some picture of who it is you're aspiring to be, make that something that doesn't, put you in a direct kind of war of exclusion with others around you. And I'm sure that comes from his experience of living in the age of religious wars. I think what Spinoza sees happening is that people divide originally over perfectly good reasons. They might divide because they have alternative approaches to solving a problem, which are both kind of equally valid. But as soon as they do that, the division starts to become the point. I think you see this with, political polarization, that originally two political parties might split because they have different opinions, valid opinions on how to deal with some problem, taxation or whatever. But then once they're in those groups, then the whole point is just to be different, to just be a part of that group and to be different from the other group. And so whatever the other group proposes, you'll propose something opposite. I think, that's the thing that really concerns Spinoza. And I think this idea of rationality is really just, try to define a nice, big, broad group in that case with very sort of open terms. But I don't think that it's the heart of his philosophy.
Yeah, it's sort of been thinking about that, and I want to pull it a bit open also to Yarran. Like, I've been thinking a lot like Spinoza's life and the way that he really tried to live in line with his philosophy. I find very striking. Like, he declined a professorship. He even declined somebody who said, "I'll make you my heir." Like he lived a very, very sparse life, and he could have lived more comfortably, but he didn't want to. So I'm just sort of thinking, Yarran and Alex, if you thought, like, as philosophers now, like, do we live enough in line with our thinking? Like, would it be helpful, like, if we lived more in line, like, what would it mean to live a philosophically informed life with respect to this question of hope, for example? I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about it specifically because I've been advocating for online events like this one, because I feel like we are using too much CO2. I certainly am. And I feel like we should have achieved like a unity of acting and what we believe. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I should say Spinoza, I think, in my book, I connect him a lot to the Chancellor. And this point about him refusing the professorships, I find really interesting, because in the Chancellor, there are several stories where somebody is offered, some kind of ordinary person just living out in the woods somewhere is offered the position of duke or emperor and refuses it and gives these reasons to refuse it. Yeah. And I thought, how interesting that Spinoza is literally one of these characters. And he's one of these characters because I think he's trying, he's living his philosophy in the sense that pride, ambition, vainglory, all of these things that come from having some notion of yourself that you're trying to aggrandize and realize is the source of all the problems for him. So to answer your question, no. I mean, I repeatedly say in the book, I try not to be like that, but you just can't help it. Somebody criticizes your writing and you feel the slight to your status, and the emotions are kind of there before you've even started to rationalize them. So that's why it's a kind of a spiritual practice, and that's also why I don't align Spinoza with this kind of rationality tradition. I don't think he's talking about some problem that you can think your way out of. It's a kind of spiritual training to somehow get yourself out of these patterns.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the idea of spiritual training and ritual and habit. And I mean, philosophers are now thinking quite a lot about this, but we all have habits in our lives that we practice as writers, for example, as teachers. We build these habits. Helen, I'm going to pivot. That was just a point about the, I think, importance of habit and that idea of spiritual training. You put the question as one of living, of your life comporting to your ideals, of philosophy coming first and then the life coming after that. I know that's not really what you meant, but that's how you put it. And one thing that I think is really fascinating and important is how philosophy can come out of living. That we live first and we philosophize afterwards. And so the ideals that we have are actually, they arise from the things that we're doing. And I think, I mean, that's, I think, a really powerful part of thought, even academic philosophical thought, that is maybe a little underappreciated, the way in which our identities and our lives outside the academy, or the things that we're doing even in the academy that aren't research, for example, it's from that material that we can form new ideas, new ideals, which gets back to the idea of imagination and envisioning that you brought up, and prophecy that you brought up earlier.
I do think, that like there's lots of things. I've been thinking a lot about this. I grew up very blue collar working class, right? And I do feel that this has a big impact in how I approach everything, even though I'm no longer working class now. So I feel like this is a thing that philosophers just don't appreciate enough. Like, we indeed seem to think that there is this thing called reason, and that, you could sort of like use this viewpoint from nowhere. That's the sort of thing that we've been trying to rail against, basically, because not just to be, woke or politically correct or whatever, but we are trying to do it because it is just wrong. This vision does not work. Right? How you're going to live really is going to impact the sorts of ideas that are even conceivable for you. And that's again why I think it's really important that we think about our lives, like, and how we lead it, because it's going to influence what we say. It's going to influence what we write, and it's going to influence how we approach things in the classroom, among others.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up this point about the view from nowhere, because I think that gives me a better answer to the question you asked earlier about rationality. I think that there's a danger to read Spinoza as endorsing a kind of rationality that's universalist, that you try to have this objective view from nowhere. You just, you think about the objective facts, which are the same for everybody. And I really don't think that that's the vision that he's presenting. I think that what happens with Spinoza is, yes, you're meant to escape your own finite, limited perspective, but you do so by entering into the perspectives of others. The ideal case, the kind of the infinitely removed ideal that you pursue when you're pursuing Beatitude is to see from every perspective at once, which of course you can't do. I think Spinoza, when he thinks about God, that's how God sees. God isn't this sort of detached observer outside of space and time. You know, God is all of us, right? That's Spinoza's whole point, is he has this idea that somehow God is each and everything. Well, I think the meaning, the ethical meaning of that notion is that, and so yeah, there's none of this idea about trying to kind of boil yourself down to this abstract nothing where your background and your experiences and, you know, your disadvantages are all supposed to magically vanish, so that you can encounter the world in this purely factual, Grandian plane.
The view from everywhere rather than the view from nowhere.
Yeah, this is so cool. Maybe we can talk more about it, but I'm also sort of a bit thinking, like, there's already quite some questions in the chat. So Anthony, I don't know what your thinking is, or if there, like, anybody has any like last minute things, but would we go towards Q&A for the audience already, or what's your thinking? Like, I would like to answer as many as possible, if possible. Like, there's a big crowd here, so I'm cognizant of that.
Okay, well, let's go for it. Thank you so much. I thought I'd start, as I mentioned in the introduction, by just, if I'm asking the questions now, just bringing in you, Helen, and your own take on it, because as I understand it, one of the chapters in your forthcoming book is looking at wonder as a source of hope, especially within the work of Rachel Carson. So I was wondering if you wanted to say a few things about your own research or thinking on the topic of hope before we move on to the Q&A.
Yeah, so in the book on wonder, hope wasn't really a sort of central idea that I started out with, but it became very clear that there's an intimate connection between, you know, hope and wonder, or rather between despair and lack of wonder. So there's a certain sense in which despair, it's a point many people, Kierkegaard, many others have made, kind of numbs you. It numbs you, it cuts you off from sources of beauty, from sources of delight. Like when you're despairing, you can't delight anymore in things. And Rachel Carson said that for her, the natural world was a continued source of hope and resilience. And she wrote those passages about how important it was for her when she was terminal. She had terminal breast cancer, and she was writing Silent Spring, you know, against the clock. Like, she really wanted to get this out. She wanted actually to write a big book on wonder, but she really wanted to get this out, because she said it's very important that we don't poison ourselves slowly, you know, with insecticides and with pesticides. And she thinks that, you know, actually cultivating wonder is a virtue. It's a virtue because it allows you, it helps you to avoid the trap of despair, and it also helps you to continue to do things that could make a positive difference in that way, because your action will flow from, you know, the way that you perceive the world. And Yarran, we were talking about this earlier, about how important that is to, like, and Rachel Carson, if you think about it, did so many things. I was really amazed researching for this book. Like, a lot of the environmental protections that we have in the US actually come from her actions. So if you think about one person being able to do so much, only now, recently with Trump, some of them have been rolled back, sadly, but she was able to achieve so much in terms of like wildlife protection, environmental protection. And so I feel like she is, I don't know, if I had to pick one exemplar philosopher, and it's kind of weird because like she's not even counted as a philosopher, but she is, then I would say Rachel Carson. Like, you know, if we could achieve what she could do with her writing, I find her so inspiring. That's just what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Helen. And yeah, I'm, like many people, extremely excited about the forthcoming publication of your book. I'm just going to briefly put a little thing of it into the chat for anyone who wants to have a look. Some people have asked me if I can send them the links. So if anyone wants the kind of links in the chat, if they don't want to be looking at it now, they can just email me at this email address I just put in the chat, and I'll send the chat transcripts. Anyway, let's get cracking. So I guess we'll go for Alex as the first person on this one, although it obviously dovetails nicely with some of Yarran's issues. So this is from John, who asks, Would a fair criticism of Spinoza's project be that it is too individualistic, that any change in society is purely in the interest of a philosopher elite rather than the liberation of the masses?
Hi, John. No, people say this about Spinoza, and it's true that in his Tractatus Theologico Politicus, he says, I don't want ordinary people to read this book. Probably not his best moment. But the reason he says it is only because he thinks that what happens in his context is books get popularized, or, excerpts from books get quoted, not unlike what happens today, I guess, on TV news. And, people fire up the anger of the crowd against, these outrageous claims that are allegedly being made by these books. I guess there are other reasons that people think that there's this philosophical elite. But the short story that I would say is I don't think Spinoza thinks that anybody has the power to transform society. Society is just this incredibly complex organic thing, like everything else in nature, that we have extremely limited power to either predict or to control. The key is to kind of be able to live with that and to put aside any hubristic notions we might have about our ability to either predict or to control this thing. I mean, yes, Spinoza talks a lot about building institutions, and you try to build the institutions that will be as fair and as secure as you can possibly make them. But I don't think that Spinoza, again, I think this is something that distinguishes Spinoza from the Enlightenment project that he's sometimes associated with. I just don't think that, I think that Spinoza has too much philosophical humility to imagine that A, there would be some way that we could program society to go in a particular direction, and B, that he would be the person to tell us how. I'll say that.
Thanks, Yarran. Do you want to follow up on John's question or anything that Alex said in response to it?
So, John, you talk first about Spinoza's project more generally, and then about changes in society. And I wonder whether there's space in Spinoza between the project of the ethics, say, and then his particular political views that he articulates in the Tractatus and elsewhere. So, yeah, Alex, I'm wondering whether you have thoughts, because it may be that Spinoza's general project is a liberatory project, but it is one which is bottom up, let's say. It's one that each self has to undergo for itself. And in that way, it's not actually a political project. The project of liberation of the ethics is not a political project.
I think that's, absolutely. That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think it's an individual liberatory project that might have political implications, I guess, is what I was trying to suggest. But no, that's definitely true. So if the concern about individualism is that, then I think Spinoza is just guilty as charged. Yeah.
Thank you. Helen, is there anything you want to bring into the conversation ignited by John's question, or are you happy to move on to another question?
Happy to move on, because I'm hoping to do many.
Okay. So I'll bring in a question by Ian Kidd, who some of you may know is one of the recent participants in one of these events, talking about pseudoscience after Feyerabend. So Ian notes, I've written it down on a piece of paper as you put it in the chat. So Ian notes that hope is often narrowly defined in relation to collective action, and is wondering if there are kinds of hope that are not tied to collective social actions, as he puts it, less muscular forms of hope, less political forms of hope. So I was thinking, Helen, do you want to have a crack at that? That may fit in with some of your ideas, or if not, we can pass it on to someone else.
I do think that hope is importantly collective, in the sense that I could lose hope. For example, I was once, unfortunately, in a civil rights group on Brexit, and I was like, I lived in the UK then, and it was really very, like, we were like marching, and I'm saying unfortunately because like at the end of the day, I really felt like how little did we achieve, like, not much in terms of like reciprocal citizen rights. It was really, but one thing I did notice was that, when you lost hope, it was not so bad, because the other people of your organization still had hope. So in that sense, I like it sort of as diffuse, but I do think like you can be like bold in your hope, like, and that's the sort of like case of civil rights activism and that sort of thing, like also in the US civil rights movement, right? But there are also meek forms of hope, if I can call it that, like timid forms of hope that I do think are also important. Like they're important, you know, just for yourself. Like it does happen. It does really matter how you feel, right? Imagine you have to say, spend 20 years, this is a horrible situation, but spend 20 years in jail where you're unjustly accused. Like you could be like, and all by yourself or something. Like think of some horrible situation. I read an account by somebody to whom this had actually happened, that he spent a lot of time in isolation. It does make a difference to you, right? If you even have the meekest of hope versus complete hopelessness. Like I do think it's such an important part of human flourishing that it doesn't necessarily need to be collective, and it doesn't necessarily even need to lead to change. It can also just individually make a difference in how, you know, how you are as a human being. I think we shouldn't lose sight of that fact.
Thanks so much, Helen. Alex, would you like to pick up on anything in Ian's question or Helen's response?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I agree completely with Helen's response. I think that Spinoza's, the sort of, you know, thing that I identify as beatitude, the hope in Spinoza is very much one of these non-muscular forms of hope. Although, you know, there was something in Yarran's essay that struck me when he talks about grief. And, you know, one of the hardest things about grief is that you've built your life around attachment, say, to a person, and then you lose the person, and then you can't see any future. You don't understand how there can be a future, really. And, you know, I've had my experiences with grief, my minor experiences. Everybody has, I guess. And the thing that I think, you know, is potentially helpful in Spinoza is just to remind yourself that, of course, the world is still full of wonderful things. You know, there are still lots of things to be treasured and enjoyed, even if you're unable to see them in the moment, because, you know, you're in this position of grief. I think that's a very important aspect of Spinoza's hope, and I don't think it connects exactly to collective action in any obvious way. Although, as Yarran's essay also points out, you know, there's always an element of hope in other people. I mean, you know, the things that are there, that are kind of there waiting for you that you can't see right now, are usually things about other people and the things you might be able to achieve with them in the future.
Thanks, Yarran. Do you want to continue anything in this thread, or do you want to move on to another question?
Yeah, I want to say a couple of things maybe. So Ian, you said that modern discourses often define hope in collective terms. And I think that's true if you look at the role of hope in, say, the civil rights movement or in anti-apartheid movements and so on. But there, as both Helen and Alex just pointed out, there are these other forms of hope which are more meek, more timid, more low-key. And there are forms of that kind of hope which are also sources of despair. Alex pointed out this kind of dynamic when you, say, have a certain set of hopes and you can't meet them, you fall into a kind of despair. And I think the most common form of hope that we have in today's society is a very individualistic, not at all political, not at all collective form of hope, which is hope for something like upward mobility. I know I hope to, you know, have a good career and have a house that I own in my own right, even though I know that's going to be impossible. And, you know, I have all these hopes which are built precisely on the continued existence of the system that is the thing screwing us up. So hope, you know, we are in a panel where everyone seems to be pretty up about hope, but I also just want to register that I'm not always up about hope. I'm actually often quite down about the role that hope plays in maintaining the structures and systems that oppress us.
Thank you. That's great. So I'm going to ask a few questions, which I'm going to put to Yarran first, because they seem to be in some way linked. So the most obvious one is this one that specifically references your essay, Yarran. It's from Phil. So he quotes your essay specifically. If hopelessness consists in the impossibility of imagining a future, then hope in others sidesteps that impossibility by focusing on the present, on the capacities of those who inhabit that present with us. End quote. So Phil then asks, how is this faith in the capacities of others different from saying something like, I hope that other people will figure it out? And then a couple of questions which are sort of related, touch on this issue of domination. So Suminku asks, this is more in relation to Spinoza, but it's touching on something you brought up, whether, given the importance of rationality, is domination rational? And then similarly, Christoph brings in Spinoza asking, what role does our interpersonal psychology play in our quest for beatitude? Does he think, as Yarran put it, that we have a desire to dominate each other that must be overcome? So there's a couple of questions that link more to your work, Yarran, a couple that link more to Alex's, but I thought I'd just let you get started on that little cluster.
Yeah. So I'll respond to Phil's question first. And the short answer is that hope in others also implicates hope in one's own capacities. One's own agencies is kind of built up. It's implicated in that relation that one has to other people, at least how I see it. So, I mean, I think maybe lying behind your question is the role that, you know, these wishful hopes, let's say, play in generating various, you know, social tendencies that we're all too aware of now. So, you know, working class people look at things and quite rightly say, well, you know, I just hope things will change. And I hope someone else will do that, right? Like, I hope that, you know, we need to drain the swamp. And so there's a way in which hope of a certain sort lends itself to being taken up by fascist or, you know, quasi-fascist or whatever political tendencies and political actors, which connects again to this desire to dominate. So that's just to say, here's another way in which hope can be dangerous when it's tied to a certain politics of anger, when it's tied to a certain, let's say, lack of self-esteem, and this, I guess, gets back to Spinoza, then it can be easily mobilized for the wrong kinds of political purposes. Yeah, I think in terms of Spinoza, I'll toss that over to Alex and Helen, but I think in Spinoza, there's a similar kind of dialectic between self-empowerment and the right kinds of relations to others that I'll let them spell out.
Yeah. Well, on the questions of domination and rationality, I mean, no, domination is not rational for Spinoza. And I think that, you know, an important part of his political program, although you have it in Hobbes as well, is to show that these things are much less rational, even in a crudely kind of instrumental, I don't know, game theory sense than you might think. You know, people can appear to be doing particularly well when they're in a position of domination, but they often aren't. I mean, for one thing, they're making themselves targets. But for another thing, I think that Spinoza really feels like the kind of crudely materialist explanations that we might give of these phenomena are not generally correct, that actually they come from a deeper psychological pathology than is immediately obvious. So, I mean, I'll give an example. As you mentioned, that I sometimes work on political economy, so I read about these things. And, you know, I've read around a lot about the question of whether the British Empire financially benefited from, whether Britain really financially benefited in net terms from having these colonies. And the question is, it's very unclear. You know, did it benefit from unequal trade with China? Yes, but the Opium Wars were extremely expensive. You get the feeling that this was really an expensive vanity project for kind of Oxbridge-educated, you know, MPs, lords who wanted to get their paintings put up in places not something that you would pursue if you were just a hard-headed kind of economic rationalist who wanted to get yourself the best deal. So I'll just say that I think that that rationality is not really the point for Spinoza in thinking about phenomena like these. That's the insight.
If I could just briefly add to that. So I kind of feel like you were talking about vanity projects, and this is definitely an important part of Spinoza's philosophy, is part 4 of the Ethics, where he talks about how we are in bondage to our passions, and particularly that we, wealth seems like it's empowering us, seems like we're realizing ourselves, like we are persevering in our being, which is very important for him. But actually we're not. We become slaves to our wealth. Like all of a sudden you have to do all sorts of things so that it doesn't go down and that it goes up, that you are, in the richest man list of Forbes. Yeah, it's usually richest man that you are near the top. And so basically you become unfree. You become like, the more stuff you have, this is a Buddhist point, I think also, the more stuff you have, the more attachments you have, the less free you are. And free also in Spinoza's way is not libertarian freedom. It doesn't mean like doing what you want, because he doesn't even think we have free will, but it's more like a kind of freedom from bad things that tether you in ways that are just, I mean, think about the wealthiest people in the world, and do they strike you as particularly happy? I just think that they seem deeply insecure. This is an important psychological point that he's making, and that definitely rings true to me.
Or the most politically powerful, or any of them.
Yeah, they just, it seems like their life is terrible. Like I wouldn't want to, maybe I'd exchange it and hopefully give it all away or something like, but I wouldn't want to trade places with these people. It just seems terrible.
Now, I will just say very quickly, I mean, for Spinoza, like if nothing else, you're constantly faced by the anxiety of losing this thing, which you will inevitably, right? So if you built your whole life around maximizing your political power or your wealth or whatever, it can't possibly give you beatitude, because it's always, whatever pleasure you get from it is always going to be accompanied by this this horrifying thought of its temporariness.
Great. So there've been a few things like, what's the relationship between hope and X, specifically trust from Joe, humility from Luke. So I was thinking we could maybe do one each. Helen, I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit on the relationship between hope and wonder, which is obviously part of that chapter. You touched on it earlier, but I was just wondering if you had any more sort of comments on why you would link wonder and hope in the way that you do.
So I'll just say this. I'm doing interviews with natural scientists for a project that is unrelated to this book. And I asked them, I will have interviewed 35 of them. And the question of climate change often comes up. I've talked to climate scientists, and like some of them are really despairing. And it's really like the psychological distress that climate scientists have to endure is very great. Like they know what's coming and they can't seem to be able to, like, what would it take for people to change, right? But at the same time, there are others who say that they derive so much hope from looking at how resilient nature is. Like you can see things changing in real time. Like they would find comfort in like seeing just a wildflower, on the pavement, on the street, like something really simple like that. And it's really interesting how for them, being open to things that are not you, basically sort of pushing yourself out of your own concerns and getting a broader viewpoint. This sort of comes back to what Alex was saying. You get a broader viewpoint of all those different viewpoints, of all those different things, flowers, trees, bugs. They all have their own point of view. Becoming aware of that helps you to get out of the sort of, get really stuck, like, oh no, I'm never going to buy a house in my life. Oh no, this is so terrible. My kids are not doing as well as they should in school, etc. But then, you see this different thing. You see like this tree is doing well, or something like this bug is flying around, and it helps you to just see that the world is bigger than you. And that's, I think, important. Despair in a sense is solipsistic, I think.
Thanks so much, Helen. So I'll move on to Alex. Maybe you could say a few words on hope and humility. I know you were saying a few words on it earlier, but I think Luke just wanted a little bit more kind of detail on this relationship as you see it.
Hope and humility. I think it's very close to what Helen just said. In fact, I think that in the Daoist texts, the Chuang-Tzu and Spinoza, that's the picture that you get is our despair is often tied to a kind of self-aggrandizement. We don't actually realize how much, there's an element of self-importance behind our despair. That, well, things are going terribly for me, so the world must be a kind of absolute nightmare. And then you have these little things that, well, of course, there are all these other experiences going on and all these other perspectives. And the wonderful thing is that we don't just have to speculate about them. We can enter into them in rare moments. I guess maybe the art of Beatitude is cultivating being able to do this more. But all of us can at some time lift ourselves out of our own perspective and into somebody else's. So if you can, the more you can do that, the more you can avoid being trapped by the particular vicissitudes of your own life. And that to me is humility. I mean, I think fundamentally the thing you have to master to be able to do that is your own pride.
Thank you, Alex. So Yarran, I'm kind of dumping this one on you. It's not entirely clear that you've written on it or thought much about it. The main reason is because A, it came up from Joe, and B, you recently introduced me to someone who wanted to write on trust for the philosophers. So I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on the relationship between hope and trust? If you don't, not a problem, but I thought I'd put that one.
Yeah. So I put some references in the chat. Victoria McGeer, who's a great philosopher, has written a lot about the connection between those two aspects of human agency, I guess. And they both kind of play, at least some people have argued, a really general background fundamental role in enabling us to be agents in the world. So we can think of trust and hope in very specific terms. I trust Anthony to do X. I trust Alex, to speak well on Spinoza. I hope that, this weekend it won't rain so that I'll be able to go out and play with my kid outside or whatever. So we can speak of trust and hope in these very specific terms, but in another sense, they're just aspects, kind of general background axes on which our agency functions. Having a kind of hope or trust in oneself seems to be some kind of general prerequisite, openness, humility, that, supports us being able to do whatever it is that we want. So thinking of hope and trust in those more general terms rather than in the specific directed terms seems to point out a very close connection between them.
That's super. So we're pretty much at time. So I'm just going to ask one question and just go around to the three of you and just a sentence or two. So it's from Nick, and it's kind of, I suppose, a broader question about the relationship between hope and philosophy as a sort of discipline or a thing. So Nick asked, why has the philosophy of hope received relatively little attention across the centuries when compared with topics such as epistemology, ethics, and ontology? So I suppose maybe the broader question is, what does the rise of interest in hope say about the kind of movement or the dynamics of philosophy? So Helen, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think so. Just to touch on another great philosopher that I want to pitch to people who don't know her is Mary Midgley, who died recently. And I think one of the big takeaways of her philosophy is that philosophy should move with the times. So she said, philosophy is not like solving a pre-existing set of puzzles. Philosophy is always like trying to find out what are the questions to ask today. So I feel like now, given the dimensions of hope that we talked about, like a source of resilience, the potential pitfalls of hope in political discourse, but also the possibilities, that this is why we are now interested in hope. I don't know, like the genealogy about why it fell to the wayside. Like, as Alex said in his book, philosophy Kant identified hope as one of the major things that philosophy should be doing things about. It hasn't done for a long time, but I think definitely now is the time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Helen. Yarran, any thoughts on hope and philosophy?
Well, I mean, hope was one of the 3 theological virtues for the Catholic tradition. And yeah, I mean, it's one of Kant's 3 questions of anthropology. So I guess it's always been there. And then Nick's question made me more about why it kind of had a bit of decline entering into the contemporary era. And I think that's probably more true of, I mean, analytic content or whatever, of the Anglo-American form of philosophy, insofar as hope, as many people will be noticing in the chat, has a lot of representation in the European tradition. So I guess that says more about our preoccupations when we're thinking about epistemology, ethics, ontology, maybe going back to the view from nowhere idea, and how that desire for a kind of view from nowhere perspective started to colonize our ways of philosophical thinking.
Brilliant. Alex, final words?
Yeah, I mean, I think both Helen and Yarran are probably right. And if Yarran is right, maybe there isn't really a trend to identify. But if there is, if it is true that philosophy kind of lost interest in hope for a while and is finding it again, I guess about why that might be is maybe hope is something like food. When you have it, you don't think about it. And then when you don't have it, it's kind of all you think about. So, we do seem to live in a time where there is a real scarcity of hope. Maybe that's why we're starting to think about it again.